Yo tengo un comentario. Yo tengo conocidas que están viviendo en unos hogares que no están al 100% bien. Están, que necesitan arreglos, la estufa, el refrigerador y la campana, y alrededor hay mucha humedad. Y le digo yo a la señora que le tiene que decir al dueño, pero ella no quiere, que porque a lo mejor la sacan. Es una señora que tiene como 60 años y eso de la humedad a ella le va a hacer daño, y el dueño nomás va y le cobra la renta. Y sí, ella le ha comentado, pero no le hace nada, no le arregla esas cosas. Y yo años atrás viví también en unos apartamentos, unas casitas, y la dueña también nomás cobraba la renta. Yo le decía, ¿sabe qué, oiga? Que el baño esto y esto tiene. Luego. Y nunca lo reparó. Había humedad también ahí porque nosotros teníamos muebles así para guardar ropa y se nos humedecía, se nos enlamaba. Entonces nosotros nos salimos de vivir de allí. Y yo he regresado a mirar y veo que ahí donde yo vivía las paredes están feas, negras, y la señora tiene niños chiquitos. Y me quedo, digo, la señora aumenta y aumenta la renta, pero no arregla. Y tiene varias propiedades, tiene casas, tiene apartamentos. Y digo, ¿qué pasó? Ella nomás piensa en el dinero, pero no piensa en el bienestar de la gente, de sus inquilinos, de sus renteros. Y es mi preocupación.
So I know a lady that she lives in a house, and she is afraid to tell her landlord to fix it. It has a lot of things. The kitchen doesn't work, the fridge doesn't work, there's a lot of humidity, and she's afraid. She's 60 years old, and she's afraid that if she tells her landlord, she's going to be kicked out. I used to live there, and I also would tell the landlord to fix things, and the only thing he was good for was coming and asking for his rent. He never repaired the bathroom. The closets were there was a lot of humidity, there was even mold. We had our clothes there, and it would get full of mold, and they never fixed it. And that was years ago. Not long ago I went back and I saw that the walls are black, they're full of mold. She has small children, and that's going to affect their health. But the thing is that they always charge rent, but they never fix what needs to be fixed.
Really challenging one here in the city of Salinas. Hopefully what we'll get to see is those who have not been seen and heard, that can be seen and heard and be taken into account when the percentage is actually, communicated and voted upon.
Have you been with this process since the start?
We've been with this process. Yes, we could definitely been with this. I'm sure, the process. I mean, we could say that the process has been going on for, since before the founding of this city. But we've been hearing, conversations around housing for the last 10, 15 years. I think basically since the housing crisis of 07, 08, where that just impacted greatly, not just our community, but nationwide. So since then, people have been, there hasn't been a strong footing around housing, around the state, the county, and, most definitely around here. So in terms of being a part of this, I've been blessed and lucky enough to work with residents, or other organizers, a team of organizers and advocates, as well as our elected officials that have taken a very, a very sincere take. They know, they could see the writing on the wall, and they're feeling that this time, this moment is for the tenants, is for the renters of Salinas.
Well, thank you. What she would say to the city for why this ordinance is important to her and to residents here in Salinas.
¿Qué es lo que quieres decirle a la ciudad? ¿Qué tan importante es esta ordenanza para para la gente, para usted?
Pues es muy importante que la ciudad sepa y reconozca el sacrificio, el esfuerzo que está sufriendo nuestra comunidad para pagar día a día las rentas tan altas que están. Los sueldos están muy bajos, una familia no puede vivir sola sin compartir renta, entonces es muy importante. Esta ordenanza va a ser una esperanza para las familias de Salinas de poder tener una vivienda por familia sin tener que compartir con más familias.
Monterey County Renters United founder.
Wonderful. Then could you walk us through what this ordinance is and what its value is to the community?
Well, the value is that if Salinas does this, they will be the first one in the whole county to pass a renter protection ordinance that really every city needs to do. Every city needs to do their own version of it, but most of our cities are more than 50% renters. So it's time that city government starts listening to the renter voice, who's been silent, mainly because they're worried about repercussions.
Could you walk us through the ways that this ordinance is intended to protect tenants and renters in the community?
I can't speak specifically to this ordinance because I haven't seen it, but in general, rent stabilization ordinances are to limit the number of percentage points and possibly how often rents can be raised on tenants. There are a number of cities all over the state that have already done it, and they have lowered the state maximum from 10% to somewhere between 3 and 5, depending on what the city is and what their demographics are.
Wow. And so you're saying you haven't seen this ordinance specifically. What brought you out to this meeting today?
Well, I'm at pretty much most of the meetings that are on the peninsula and here in Salinas because my group is countywide to help the renters be heard. And Salinas is ahead of everybody, so I'm here to support them and the council members that are brave enough to put this forward with all the opposition that they get from corporate money and realtors that all are the ones that are controlling the market right now. Yeah, I would like to see everybody that is a renter come out and support the election. We have a bill that is a state proposition on the November ballot that would help renters by repealing Costa-Hawkins, which is a bill that would allow individual cities to create their own rental control or rent policies that right now are limited by this bill that's been on the books since the 1980s, I think, maybe even the 70s. And it gives power back to each individual city to create their own policy according to the needs of their residents. And the renters really need to come out and support the candidates that are pushing for renter protections as well as the actual ballot measure.
Hello everyone. Buenas noches a todos que vinieron. So we're going to start with a brief introduction of our staff here. My name is Cristina Gonzalez with the Community Development and Housing. We also have our city attorney, Christopher Callahan here. And then we have our consultant via Zoom that will be presenting a data analysis. So, gracias por venir. Mi nombre es Cristina González con el Departamento de Desarrollo de Viviendas. Aquí tenemos el representante legal de la ciudad, Christopher Callahan, y también tenemos a la compañía que va a presentar la información sobre el análisis de esta ordenanza. David, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over so you can start your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is David Zender. I'm a managing principal with Economic Planning Systems. And with me today is Tom Martins, Vice President with EPS. And today we're going to take you through our economic analysis of the proposed rent stabilization ordinance. Next slide, Tom. So just to get going, we're going to cover the following in today's presentation. We'll give you some introduction and background, including who the rent stabilization would affect, some context from the larger world, and then a discussion of local effects of this type of program. Yes, okay. Introduction and background. Yeah, so we're going to provide in this presentation some background regarding the state context, and then have a full discussion of local effects. That will include a literature review, discussion of key questions and findings, and then our overall conclusions and recommendations. So broadly, in specific terms, rent stabilization protects tenants from unaffordable rent increases while providing landlords a reasonable return on investment through a maximum annual rent increase. So this is in effect the thesis for the entire analysis that we've done. We've attempted to really thread the needle in terms of achieving both objectives. And that is really the key to success when designing a program of this nature. It should be noted that the rent stabilization program would only apply multifamily residential dwelling units built before 1995. Pretty much everything else is exempt. So the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing and California Tenant Protection Act was adopted in 1995 and amended in 2018. That law caps rent increases at the lesser of 5% annual increase plus the increase in consumer price index, or 10%. So it's a fairly healthy allowance. And in some markets, it really wouldn't have that much effect with a increase set that high. So local jurisdictions can enact their own ordinance with their own rent increase cap, limited to the categories that we just discussed. And it's important to note that under that scenario, the local ordinance will be subject to what's called vacancy decontrol. Vacancy decontrol allows landlords to set the rent back up to the market rate when there's turnover and a new tenant comes in. And that turns out to be a really important element of financial feasibility for the landlord. Okay, next slide. Local housing inventory. So this just puts a graphic to the number of units that are qualified under this program. So pretty much what we're looking at is on the right-hand side, the top gray box, 8,330 qualifying rental units, which is 18.7% of the housing units in the city. So you can see it is a fairly limited component of the overall housing supply in Salinas. Next slide. So potential pros and cons of rent stabilization. So on the positive side, potential outcomes include increased housing stability, including reduced displacement of racial minorities, reduced worker turnover, improved educational outcomes, reduced demand for social services. So these are all fundamentally sort of driving around the notion that rent stabilization results in longer tenures among renters. And so as a result, there's just a kind of a range of positive outcomes that stem from that. Increased discretionary income to help the local economy, protecting communities of color from historical housing cost burdens, increased income equality. So those are the sought-after positive outcomes of the program. Concerns around the program would be, and these are somewhat, often cited by opponents of these programs, and they include reduced rental unit supply, reduced residential mobility, reduced property value, decreased revenue overall to the landlord, and inflated rent as a result of vacancy decontrol. So what we can tell you is that we're going to look at some empirical evidence in the next couple slides, but the empirical evidence appears to dispel many of the concerns that show up on the right-hand side of the column here. Next slide. So some of the key findings, we have a very large literature review section in our full report with a full bibliography, but some of the highlights of data analysis include the following. Tenants in rent-stabilized apartments have longer tenures, as I mentioned just a minute ago. And that has a range of positive effects. Moderate rent stabilization policies with exemptions for new construction find little or no effect on new housing supply. And I'm going to talk about what we mean by moderate in just a moment. Also, they may generate a minimal shift toward for-sale housing. Now, there's a lot of headwind in terms of converting multifamily apartments built before '95 to condos. And so that really slows down and sort of gets in the way of the conversion process that could occur. There's also construction defect litigation affecting condominiums, and so at the end of the day, that's also a problem for the owner. So it's not an automatic shift toward for-sale housing. And then finally, rent control does not directly decrease income inequality. In fact, the benefits of housing rental expenditures and neighborhood stability are much more impactful for low-income households. So continuing with this discussion, moderate rent stabilization policies allow for vacancy decontrol, as mentioned earlier, and allowances for capital improvements. So if you can meet those criteria, then these policies have been shown to have little or no effect on property values. Similarly, moderate rent stabilization policies, which allow landlords to return on investment in building improvement, do not depress the amount of building maintenance. So when we talk about moderate, what do we mean? Moderate in this case means the ordinance allows for vacancy decontrol, that allows for the rent to be reset to market when the tenant leaves the property. Automatic inflationary adjustments in the rent, which most stabilization programs have, and the one proposed here does. And finally, ability for landlords to petition for individual rent increases. For example, capital improvements or increased operating costs. And if you can provide those features in the program, many of the often cited negative consequences of rent stabilization are negated. And you do have a number of positive impacts as is below on the slide: sales tax, workforce benefits, etc. Next slide. All right. Why is rent stabilization important in Salinas? What's driving the need for a program like this? And I think some of these factors really spell it out clearly. To start with, 53% of city households comprise 81% of renter-occupied units in Salinas, compared to 30% countywide and 37% statewide. So you can see there's a very different composition in your housing market in Salinas compared to the state. You're also younger, with 57% of renter-occupied households age 44 or younger, compared to 37% countywide. Overcrowding increased 24% in the last decade compared to only 6% statewide. 53% of the city's renter-occupied households have 4 or more occupants, compared to 27% statewide. It's almost double. Okay, so you can see these trends are all sort of moving in the same direction. In Salinas, you have basically a very strong export industry in agriculture, and namely produce. And as a result of being in an industry of that nature and being in basically a Bay Area style housing market, you know, the expenses are similar to the Bay Area, is an unfortunate combination. And so it's unique. And there's not very many cities in the state that have these two these two factors of being entrenched in the ag sector and then being one of the most expensive housing economies. So therefore, it's really important to address the issue of rent stability. This chart shows you a little bit more about what it all means. And if you look at pre-95, this is all pre-95 households. So for a pre-95 household, the difference between a sustainable rent burden at 30% and what's being charged in Salinas is $400 per month. So in effect, that's the gap, all right? So if you look at the chart and you look at sort of what's going on here before 2020, everything to the left of 2020, you can see that without exception, the average multifamily rent is higher than the median renter household income. The data to the right involves the pandemic and restabilization after the pandemic, so it's a little bit less reliable, but certainly right up to 2020, you can see a very clear pattern, and that's effectively what we're addressing here. So this chart shows a couple of things. It's really looking at various cities that have enacted rent stabilization ordinances. The three cities on the left, Salinas, Oxnard, and Antioch, you can see are all fairly similar. What you see here is on the top, the median rental household income increased from 2012 to 2022 in Salinas by 32.9%. And that number was 25% and 17% for Oxnard and Antioch respectively. If you look at the next section down, the monthly effective increase in rent, same period, 2012 to 22, you can see rent went up in Salinas 73.7% as compared to household income of 33%. Oxnard was 63% to 25%. Antioch 66% to 17.5%. So you can see that these cities also had great rationale for implementing rent stabilization. These programs are relatively new. You can see 2022 in those cases, and therefore haven't necessarily had time to take effect. But you can see that there's a lot of cities that are relatively similar. There are other cities in the state that have incurred, really large median household income increases at the same time that they've seen the effective rent increases. So on the right hand of the spectrum, Richmond and Sacramento fall into that category. And then you also have various cities where the income is increased really a lot, but the rental income was already so high that on a percentage basis, it pales in comparison to household income increases. Mountain View and Oakland would fall into those categories. So bottom line is, every city is different, and each has its own unique context. But we do see, a really pronounced pattern in Salinas that mirrors other areas in the state that are really struggling with their rental economy. Basically, what you see when you have those dynamics is displacement. And displacement is a function of disparity between rent increases and household incomes, as we just discussed. We know that in Salinas it's particularly pronounced by the ag economy and the shortage of farm worker housing. It's also sort of exacerbated through overcrowding and these high housing cost burdens. The affordability crisis, in short, disproportionately affects people of color and other vulnerable communities because these populations are far more highly represented in the rental population. Okay, so that is the driving rationale. Another element of this that we've incorporated in the analysis, you can go to the next slide please, is the peer city experiences. And as I just described, we've looked at a vast range of cities, looking at a number of different criteria and factors in terms of recommended rent limit percentages. We've also looked at the tenant side of things in terms of protections, what these cities spend in staffing for such programs, and then how much does it cost to basically run one of these programs. So we're going to touch on some of those factors in just a couple moments. The next piece here, next slide, is on the fiscal question. What are the potential fiscal implications of a rent stabilization ordinance? And I can tell you that we think it's basically a wash. First of all, property tax only accounts for about 21% of the city's general fund revenue. So it's natural to think that a reduction in the the rental amount will lead to a reduction in assessed value, and there is a slight reduction to property tax in that regard. However, there's also increased revenue in cases where there is conversion to ownership, and there's also increased sales taxes due to the reduced turnover and the retaining of discretionary income in these neighborhoods. So in effect, there's countervailing effects, and the overall impact of the program is largely mitigated by the fact that it affects less than 13% of the city's residential assessed value. Next key question to look at is, what are the estimated impacts of different rent stabilization ordinance scenarios on property owners? So here you see we've done a number of analyses and charts on this topic because it's very important. We have to be satisfied that the market is still functional with this program. And so what we have here is over a 10-year period. You can see we've analyzed how much the rental revenue would decline based on different percentage reductions. And you can see that generally the different scenarios we're looking at here are market rate, 100% of CPI, 80% of CPI, that's consumer price index, and 60% of CPI. And so you can see that generally the rental revenue decreases based on these limitations, as you would expect, generally ranging from a loss of 2% to 8% revenue over a 10-year period. Now the chart on the bottom is very interesting because what we've done there is we've looked at the percentage of CPI ranging from 60% on the left to 100% on the right. And we've matched that with effective rent roll growth based on the assumptions you can see below in the footnote. But generally speaking, you can see that at 65%, we're right around, say, 2.5%. And if we're at 75% of CPI, we're at 2.74% increase. And the way that these ordinances generally work is you're taking the lesser of the percentage of CPI or the actual percentage allowed. And so in this case, the reference numbers that we're looking at very closely are the 65 to 75% range, or 2.5% to 2.75%. So what we wanted to do is we want to satisfy ourselves that those percentage increases in operating expenses are reasonable from the standpoint of the landlord. And so we've looked at various baskets of goods in terms of trying to understand what the landlord would be facing in year-over-year expense increases. And we've had discussions with the Technical Advisory Committee about this topic. And I think that the chart on the bottom is I think, very helpful, and I want to focus on that just for a moment. And this is basically looking at, sorry, let me get kind of on my notes here. Low-income housing tax credit operating expenses year over year. And so basically what you can see is over this entire period, there's a lot of volatility. You have periods of relatively low expenses and then periods of higher expenses. Post-pandemic, we seem to be experiencing much more volatility. If you look at the 2014 to 19 period, the average there is about 3%. And if you look at the entire range, it's about 5%. But that gives you a sense of what we're looking at here. And it's certainly possible that this type of apartment product incurs higher operating expense increases than the pre-95 multifamily sample that we're analyzing in Salinas. So we actually feel that something in the range of 2.5 or 2.75% per annum stands up to the data. Next slide. So this gives you a sense of returns to the landlords with this program in place. And so what you can see is On the top here, internal rate of return comparison with 3% operating expense inflation. So an internal rate of return basically measures the return of and on an investment. So the scenario that we're analyzing here is the purchase of an apartment complex, the operation of that apartment complex, and the signal of the complex at the end of 10 years. And so under the 3% operating expense or OPEX assumption, we're really looking at 80% to 60%, kind of a range there of 10 to 11% on a leveraged basis. Leverage just means that the analysis incorporates the use of financing. And in general, your returns are going to be better if your basic rate of return exceeds your cost of interest, which they do. So in this case, the leverage returns 60 to 80% are 10 to 11% when you increase operating expenses at 3%. If you bump those operating expenses to 5%, you see those returns drop, and we're down in the 7 to 9%. So you can see how the returns are sensitive to those operating expense inflation. Is 7% really enough given the amount of expertise and the amount of risk involved in the project? You can purchase a certificate of deposit or a CD right now and earn about a 5% return. So you can see that's relatively easy compared to a 7% return at 60%. So, we think that there's a range that's just higher than 60%, just lower than 80%, that we think is viable here, that delivers the right sort of return to the landlord while protecting the tenant. Here you can just see this. We also applied the same analysis to a number of additional markets just to illustrate the returns in those markets and to also illustrate the notion that each context is different. But you can see on the top portion of this, the returns that we just looked at, Salinas at 60 to 80% being 10 to 11, or excuse me, 7 to 11% overall. And then you can see sort of a similar range for these other cities, varying depending on very specific situations in their local markets. All right, so we're going to come back. A quick note on the program implementation. So with the program of rent stabilization, you would need to bring on probably a couple of staff to help implement the program and to see through all the programmatic aspects and to track the units that are subject to the program. And so if you're going to add 2 staff people or 3 staff people in this case, 3.2 was the minimum that we identified. You currently have 2 staff people for your rental registry program, but the cost of the program with 3.2 staff would be about $600,000. And our findings are that a fee of $27 per unit per year would basically fund that program. As part of this analysis, we also determined that the way that the city charges for its current rental registry program leaves a little bit of money on the table and tends to benefit the larger properties. And we're recommending that if you charge on a per unit basis instead of the current approach where it's charged a different manner, then you're going to be able to generate a lot more money. And so we recommend a slight shift in the way that the fee is basically funded. And this is explained more in the report. So to bring it all back to a head, we believe rent stabilization is a toolkit that, along with other policies and incentives, can alleviate housing pressures in Salinas. But it is important to note that this needs to be combined with other policies and other renter protections and additional housing supply to provide more of a multi-pronged effort to improve the outlook for residents that are struggling to afford housing in Salinas. So we recommend the city consider adopting the rent stabilization ordinance. And we've identified a range, an optimal cap range, kind of providing a minimum and maximum to focus on at this stage. And, I think that we've narrowed this range down a little bit over time. We're going to continue to analyze it, but we think this represents a viable position given all the criteria and all the conditions that we just discussed. So we would recommend that the city consider adopting rent stabilization ordinance, capping annual rent increases to the lesser of 2.5% to 2.75% increase per annum, or 65 to 75% of the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, for all urban consumers, Western U.S. And that is essentially our presentation. That concludes my remarks, and I look forward to hearing your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Just to get back on table 19, that the effective rent growth, what is that's showing is when you incorporate vacancy control. So some of your units are going back to market rate, so that all the apartments are not paying that reduced rent. So this shows the effective rent. It's very important to have vacancy control incorporated.
Yeah, it is a really important feature, and it sort of allows the landlords to maintain the rate of return that we're looking at here. And without that, it would be a less positive picture and may not be considered to be a more moderate policy, such as we are recommending. Thank you.
Thank you, David and Tom, for that presentation. At this time, we're going to open it up for questions. We are limited on time, so we're going to open it for 10 minutes. After that, if you have any comments or additional questions, we do have a board for you to write down your questions.
Hi, I'm concerned about the way that this is phrased, because allowing every time a unit turns over to be reset to market rate incentivizes the turnover to take place. And then it leaves the people who have left the unit looking at units that have all been reset to find a place to live when they probably have left the unit that they're in because they couldn't afford it already. So I'm really concerned about that, because while we need this ordinance, it doesn't go far enough to protect and maintain the people that are living here and working here, because it drives them to other areas where they might be able to afford to live more, because once rents are reset to market rate, it doesn't help them at all. And at this point, we've created a permanent renter class, and we can't keep allowing market rates that are very easily manipulated by corporations that have large number of units, that once they reset the rates, it manipulates the market rate.
Thank you for that comment. I just want to provide clarification. This would be the time to ask questions regarding the data that was presented. We will be taking comments at the end.
There's a lot of data, it's good data. I'm asking whether this has been looked at through the lens of what's happening in the California insurance industry.
Was that referring to the insurance industry?
Yes, it refers to California insurance companies are arbitrarily dropping policies, and when you go to look for a new policy, the increase is astronomical. For instance, I have one that just takes effect today that went from $885 a year to $4,251 a year, 385% increase in insurance. So though I'm sensitive to this data, asking it how you overlaid what's happening in the insurance industry.
Yes, I would agree. Insurance is one of the truly volatile components of operating expenses. And it is something that does drive some of those charts we looked at, where you see those really jagged curves and severe increases of late. And so there's no denying that is a concern. So I would acknowledge that. Tom, is there anything that you would say about that?
Yeah, I mean, it is definitely something that's been pronounced since around 2021, 2022. And it's definitely something that's going to need to probably be addressed at the state level. Not necessarily at the local level, but it does need to be addressed. However, that is one of the reasons why we recommended there needs to be an appeal process for owners. When these sorts of insurance increases come from this company, so that landlords aren't paying them money.
Yeah, I want to just emphasize that, and I don't know if I hit that hard enough in the presentation, but we do believe that there should be a viable appeal process embedded, and that's part of what that would make this a more moderate policy.
So I've got a question. How is rent control creating more housing? You talked about 45,000 units needed, and I'm kind of trying to figure out, okay, so we help people out, lower the rents, how does that make more housing? Because the rents are high because there is not enough housing.
Thank you for the question. First of all, we don't see that as a major dynamic here. We don't think there's going to be a lot of conversion to housing. It is just something that does show up in certain locations around the U.S., in certain situations. But the reason why rent stabilization or rent control could lead to something like that is the landlord simply says, all right, well, you're capping my year-over-year revenue. I think I'm just going to convert this to a condo and sell it. And so that may be something that happens in certain markets, but in terms of taking multifamily units prior to '95 and thinking about that context here, we don't see it as a major dynamic. Tom, you add anything to that?
I think I might have interpreted this question slightly differently. I think he was just asking how this will help generate those needed 45 units, that is separate, and that's actually, but it is one of the reasons why this only applies to units that were built before 1995, so they're bumped to prevent people from building new housing stock. That is what's really important, is to increase supply. So that's my thought.
Just a quick thought, things go up because of supply and demand. And until we increase the supply of housing, things are going to continue to go up, regardless of whether the government steps in or not. It's just the way it is.
I would tend to, I believe supply is also an incredibly important aspect, and we just need more housing in general, and so I think it is important not to see this program in isolation, but as part of a larger bucket of tools that we need to use.
Hi, I got a question for you. Why is your data approximately almost 5 years old or older than that? Just in the last year and a half, increases of 30 to 35% have gone on everything from groceries to gasoline, to everything else. And we don't have a rent control problem, we have a housing problem. So you're looking at this the whole wrong way. Before you can have rent control, you have to have a housing where you can fit every individual in Salinas in it. And you want to make that affordable? I don't see how these numbers make that affordable. If I was a home, a renter, excuse me, I would look at this and be like, where do you get these numbers? Because they don't make any revenue, because just alone the insurance on homes, auto and everything else went up approximately 25 to 40% depending, and some people can't even get insurance at the moment. And some have gone up an additional 45%. It depends where you live and if you're in a certain zone. Like for us, it's like we're in an earthquake zone, that's what we want to call it. And some people, like, we're in a flood zone, Montevidea's in a flood zone.
Is that a comment or a question? I'm sorry.
That's a question, sir. How do you get this information? Because it's pretty old information, and I don't see how I can look into it and sink my teeth in this and believe that it's real, because it's old information.
Well, I can just tell you that all the data provided is the most recent available.
No, come on. You don't live in Salinas.
So my question is, I have that you said vacancy decontrol is important for landlord feasibility. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think we mentioned that.
So what you're saying is that this rent control model is not sustainable for landlords who have long-term tenants.
That, it is. I think you have to take it on a case-by-case basis. We're dealing with larger citywide context here. On a project-by-project basis, there can be a lot of variety. But what we're looking at here is really the larger context and taking all things into consideration, applying the data that's available. And I think we've sort of spelled it out here. And the thing to recognize is that when there is turnover, and that the new tenant comes in at then current market rate, that tenant is protected by rent control going forward until there's another turnover. So it's not like rent control just goes away, or rent stabilization just goes away. It's just a one-year reset, and then that reset is subject to continued rent stabilization.
Yes, but your findings have shown this encourages tenants to stay long-term. So what is the sweet spot number of years? We've had a tenant for 32 years. So how long do you want them to stay to make it sustainable for a landlord?
Yeah, please, go ahead, Tom.
No, I was going to say, you have to assume that there are other units that will balance that out. In the case where there's not, then you just take advantage of the appeal process, demonstrating that your operating costs, you can't cover the rent cut.
I have another person.
So wouldn't this in fact lead the owners to decide to convert, to sell and convert to townhouses or condos and actually reduce your housing?
So we acknowledge the possibility of that in the presentation. We don't see that conversion to condos or townhomes is a major threat. In fact, if it does occur, then the city does benefit from a property tax perspective, which is a slightly different issue. But because it is a dicey proposition in California to convert to condos because of the defect mitigation, I think there's some disincentives in that regard as well. So it may just balance out.
On your presentation tonight, you said the numbers was 2.5% to 2.75%, but online it says 2.5% to 3%. Which one is accurate?
2.75.
Hi there. I'm an apartment building broker. I sell apartment buildings. That's the context I'm coming at you from. So I think a lot of your math is wrong. I'd like to know, one, what on acquisitions, what cap rates you assume a buyer is going to purchase a property at for your IRRs. And number two, what debt the buyer is going to acquire a building at. And number three, how can, your expenses are way off, because like this gentleman said about insurance alone, and the labor costs on repairs and everything else that these people incur on these things, your numbers are wrong. So how can a landlord stay profitable, especially if they have a fairly new acquisition, where you're going to tell somebody they can raise rent at 2 3/4, but their expenses are growing at 5? How does that math model work out? And obviously you guys took some IRR classes and MBA classes. I have a CCIM class. I understand what this stuff means. So first things first, what cap rate do you assume on an acquisition? 2, what's the market rate debt that a buyer is going to acquire at today? And please don't BS me, because I do this every day. And how 2 3/4 versus 5%. How's that going to work? And then for you, the attorney, you wrote this stuff about wanting a fair rate of return and keep capital coming to Salinas. I think you should answer that, because it's going to be the opposite.
So, first, I think we showed, for LIHTC, for example, operating expenses 2014 to 2019,
we're not there.
3%.
We're today. We're in 2024. Not 23, not 19, we're in 2024. Use your brain.
Okay,
Any other assumptions?
Let's see. I'm actually trying to find those.
The debt assumption was 30%, I believe.
Interest rate.
Cap rate, I'm not sure exactly what that was.
Cap rate 6%.
And I think we have to, as analysts, you have to look at the longer data range and not cherry pick specific years subject to more extreme volatility. And we're in a relatively volatile time right now, acknowledged. So, I think as mentioned, we're trying to basically drive this up the middle. And I think we've chosen a range here and a rationale for that range. And we've used the data, the most recent data, appropriately applied, throughout this analysis. And we think it holds together.
thank you, David. And just a word about the quorum. This is obviously a topic that has a lot of folks' attention. You may not agree with the city, you may not agree with each other, but please make sure that you show everyone respect when they're providing responses to your questions or when questions are being asked. Thank you.
I know that the owners are asking questions that are convenient for them, but can you just repeat how 2% or 2.5% will be helpful for both sides, like the renters and the owners? because I think they're not understanding. But can you just say that one more time, how 2% will be beneficial for both sides?
So as mentioned at the outset thank you for the question, and at the outset of the presentation, we discussed, protecting tenants from unaffordable rent increases while protecting landlords by providing a reasonable return on investment. And so it's our view that we've done our best to satisfy both of those conditions in this analysis. And on the property owner side, we believe that those associated returns in the 10 to 11% IRR range are reasonable given the overall risk profile. So we think that on one hand, keeping the rents to the 65 to 75% or 2.5 to 2.75% actual percentage is protecting the tenants and generating a return of 10 or 11% or something in that range protects the landlord. And perhaps the tenants may like something lower and the landlords might like something higher. But given the totality of the information that we have access to, this is sort of our recommendation.
I have a question. You have set a parameter of a 2.5 to 2.75 or the CPI on a yearly basis. So my question is going to be, what is the threshold that under this program is it going to set for the market on average rent? So being a landlord, if the landlord looks at understanding that they have a threshold of 2.5 to 2.7 or 65 to 75% of CPI, you do not see under this program that the threshold is going to raise the rents automatically to cover years of increases that they're not going to be able to have. To be able to cover both management, rent control is going to create non-affordable repairs and maintenance under this program. So as a landlord, the threshold of rent automatically gets increased for X amount of time to stay within the market. So under your program, do you not foresee rents going up automatically, because this will only set year to year, but will not allow for that repairs and maintenance and cost of management?
Thanks. I believe that the escape valve, or the adjustment, in terms of extraordinary cost incidents, would be through the appeal process, which is I think a very important component of the overall ordinance. So hopefully with that feature in place, it allows you to make a case if you're just not able to make ends meet given these parameters.
I have another question, kind of connected with many of the previous ones. How is it that today, without much restrictions on raising the rent, it is still not profitable enough to supply enough houses, and then you assume that with the new restrictions making ownership less profitable, there will be more housing? Are we not going in the direction of Venezuela, Argentina, and other countries?
Thank you. So I believe, I'm having a little trouble hearing, so I apologize in any of these questions. I'm doing my best. But I don't believe that there's any real connection between this program and the feasibility of new housing. So, and I do understand that there is, considerable supply in the pipeline in Salinas through various specific plans. And I would agree that those projects are incredibly important in terms of correcting the housing market in Salinas. So I don't disagree with what I think I heard. Was there another question?
Well, I simply wanted to repeat that if there was not enough incentive so far to build enough, how restricting the incentive will improve the situation, will increase the amount of available housing. And another kind of more philosophical thing is, does everybody need to live in California?
Tom, did you hear? I'm having trouble picking it up.
Yeah, it's similar, I think, is what he's sort of saying, the same things we discussed, that, again, this is to help those who are in those existing structures, pre-95 structures. Does not apply to new construction, so would not have an impact on the feasibility of any new housing coming online. As far as the cost of build housing, again, it's statewide. It's high cost construction, high costs, high materials costs, length of time for permitting various things. But those are all things that need to be addressed. They're not part of this, which is just looking at the rent being paid for pre-95 construction apartments.
Yes, I have a question about the selection of certain units versus units that are rental units that are not part of the program. So you mentioned that this would apply to 18% of the rental units that are out there in Salinas. Did you look at attempting to expand that? It seems like if this only applies to 18% of the rental units, that's less than 1 in 5 rental units that will be affected by this.
Thank you, and those are the parameters that we were given to conduct the analysis. We were not involved in those aspects, which were, initially identified in the Costa-Hawkins legislation back in '95. But yeah, so the analysis of only the 95 and earlier multifamily is given for us as we conducted the analysis. Does that make sense?
Hi, I just wanted to point out something because there's a constant referral back to how is rent control going to build more affordable housing. And it's not supposed to. They're two different issues. You need to be able to have the rents under control until you build enough housing. So it has to be a side-by-side policy. We've got to keep building, but unless you can build overnight, we're going to keep adding to the homelessness problem and the workforce leaving. And, if you're saying not everybody should live in California if they can't afford to, well, how is this state and this city going to function if everybody that can't afford to live here moves? That's just not a realistic way to approach this issue. But this constant, referral to how is this going to build more housing? It's not supposed to. It's supposed to be a temporary solution until we build more housing. And then, according to the laws of supply and demand, we should be able to stabilize the rents then. But we're talking about decades down the road because we have been decades behind in building more housing. So until then, we need to do something to keep people here. And if we don't, we're going to lose all the people that are working here and add to the homeless problem, which I'm sure nobody in this room wants to see happen.
Good evening. I'm here as a listener, learner, trying to digest all of this with deep concern for everyone in my city, from the homeless to those that are investing in it. And I find this really baffling, as probably everybody in the room does, in terms of digesting why this would only apply to 18% of the landlords, how it's really going to fix the problem. How are you going to incentivize for landlords to continue to be viable landlords in this city? I mean, would you want to invest in this kind of a situation with, as they pointed out, insurance beyond anyone's control? But at the same time, it's like something has to be done. And I agree with the comment that just was made that we're 10 years away probably from any affordable housing. And if you really study the city and the county plan, only a small percentage of that housing goes to those that are low and very low income. Much of it goes to at-market value homes. So it's still padding the pockets of the real estate developers and not truly answering the needs of the community here. You know, Salinas, rich in land, rich in values. I keep looking at that on our city cars and wonder whose land and whose values. And how do we embrace everyone? Because as was pointed out, this kind of a formula doesn't necessarily solve all the problems. While I came in here in support of the concept of rent stabilization, I don't know that this necessarily answers what the needs are. More has to be done, and there's going to be a lot of gaps. How are we going to address the increase in homelessness? And it's not just, you know, the undesirables as people want to label homeless, you know, those that may have drug addiction or mental health issues. We all know that exists. What about the families? What about those people I see in wheelchairs? You know, the elderly that are literally dying on the streets. Are we going to stay in a lack of apathy, or are we going to come up with some real solutions? I don't have answers. I don't have a magic wand, but I'm going to keep listening and learning and caring until something is done.
That, you know, this notion of a multi-pronged strategy is really critical. And I agree with that. So this is but one of several things that need to happen.
Okay, so thank you, David and Tom, for that presentation and for fielding those questions. Just one last pass around the room. Is there any last question that you have of David and Tom before we cut this off?
I have a question about the appeals process and how's that going to look? Because you're the city attorney, so we're probably going to be talking to you. Yes. So our insurance goes up 20-30% easily. If we come to you and say we need above 5%, you're going to give us a 20% increase of what our, if it went up $40,000, would you give us that $40,000?
So it couldn't go up above what state law provides. The cap is at 5%. So what you would be arguing for there is the difference between what the city council puts in its ordinance and what state law provides. And so there's a hearing officer process for that, where you would submit all of the information you have which you think justifies that additional rent increase. The hearing officer will make a determination, and then depending on which way it goes, there's a right to appeal that decision to the city council. I don't recall the specific time period. They are in the draft ordinance, the time periods.
So how could you ever do any major improvements to it?
Okay, so it sounds like we're getting on to the next part of this discussion. So David and Tom, thank you for your time tonight. Okay, so now we're going to spend a few minutes talking about the rent stabilization ordinance, and this will be brief. Again, my name is Chris Callahan. I'm the city attorney. We're going to go to slide 3, please. So the presentation that you just received is now on the city's website. You can access it there. There is a difference between the one that was presented tonight and the one that was previously posted. The updated presentation is there. David and his team are working on the full economic analysis. We expect to have that done within the next couple of weeks before the Housing and Land Use Commission meeting. That will be available also for all of you to review and digest and provide your comments on. The draft ordinance is also now on the Community Development Department's website, and it consists of 3 components. The first is the rent stabilization component. That's what David and his team just spoke about tonight. And as you're reviewing that ordinance, you will notice that there's a section that's highlighted, and that section has some blank spaces in it. Those blank spaces are for the amount of the percent increase that the City Council will ultimately approve. We don't have those in there because we're making a recommendation to the City Council. They will ultimately decide what that percentage increase will be. I also want to note that there is one significant change from the previous draft ordinance. The limits on the rent increase will be made retroactive to December 31st of 2023. So any rent increases which took place after that, which are inconsistent with the ordinance that's ultimately adopted, will need to be rolled back to December 31st of 2023. That's something that a lot of cities have done. That's the direction that we've received here for our draft ordinance, and so that's another significant change that you will see in the draft that's online now. Other than that, we provided some clarification as to which properties it applies to, and the processes that we spoke about in terms of getting just cause increase or a request for something beyond what the City Council approves. The second portion of this is the tenant protection and just cause eviction. It provides the city's interpretation of what protections need to be provided to the tenants that are above what state law provides. This is substantially the same as it was before in the earlier draft. It's been reorganized, and again, some definitions have been provided. Anti-harassment is virtually the same ordinance as you've seen in the past. I encourage you to go and take a look at these online and submit any comments or edits or whatever you have about those 3 ordinances. So far, we have received very little in terms of actual comments directly on the ordinances. So let's go to the last slide, please, and we'll talk about the next steps in the process. Okay, so again, please continue to submit your comments and edits. There's an opportunity to do that online. You can do it directly to my office. The TAC meeting, we will schedule that soon, sometime before the Housing and Land Use Committee, hopefully, which is on August 13th. The August 13th meeting is really important because that's where staff will receive the final recommendations and direction from the Housing and Land Use Committee, which we will fold into the final draft ordinances that we will present to the City Council on August 20th. So that all 3 ordinances will be discussed there for introduction and possible adoption by the City Council, and it will become effective 30 days after whenever the City Council chooses to adopt them. So that's in terms of the process. Again, I encourage you to go online, review those ordinances, and get us your comments as quickly as you can prior to the Housing and Land Use Committee meeting. So with that, we'll open it up to any other additional questions that folks have or other comments that you may have. Otherwise, staff has some comments about what you see on the walls here in terms of different development projects that are coming forward, but we'll pause here and we'll open it up to questions.
Yo tengo un comentario. Yo tengo conocidas que están viviendo en unos hogares que no están al 100% bien. Están, que necesitan arreglos, la estufa, el refrigerador y la campana, y alrededor hay mucha humedad. Y le digo yo a la señora que le tiene que decir al dueño, pero ella no quiere, que porque a lo mejor la sacan. Es una señora que tiene como 60 años. Y eso de la humedad a ella le va a hacer daño. Y el dueño nomás va y le cobra la renta. Y sí, ella le ha comentado, pero no le hace nada. No le arregla esas cosas. Y yo años atrás viví también en unos apartamentos, unas casitas, y la dueña también nomás cobraba la renta. Yo le decía, ¿sabe qué, oiga? Que el baño esto y esto tiene. Luego. Y nunca lo reparó. Había humedad también ahí porque nosotros teníamos muebles así para guardar ropa y se nos humedecía, se nos él la amaba. Entonces nosotros nos salimos de vivir de allí. Y yo he regresado a mirar y veo que ahí donde yo vivía las paredes están feas, negras. Y la señora tiene niños chiquitos. Y me quedo, digo, la señora aumenta y aumenta la renta, pero no arregla. Y tiene varias propiedades, tiene casas, tiene apartamentos. Y digo, ¿qué pasó? Ella nomás piensa en el dinero, pero no piensa en el bienestar de la gente, de sus inquilinos, de sus renteros. Y es mi preocupación.
So I know a lady that she lives in a house and she is afraid to tell her landlord to fix it. It has a lot of things. The kitchen doesn't work, the fridge doesn't work, there's a lot of humidity, and she's afraid. She's 60 years old, and she's afraid that if she tells her landlord, she's going to be kicked out. I used to live there, and I also would tell the landlord to fix things, and the only thing he was good for was coming and asking for his rent. He never repaired the bathroom. The closets were there was a lot of humidity, there was even mold. We had our clothes there and it would get full of mold and they never fixed it. And that was years ago. Not long ago I went back and I saw that the walls are black, they're full of mold. She has small children and that's going to affect their health. But the thing is that they always charge rent, but they never fix what needs to be fixed.
So I'm just going to repeat the comment that I made at the very beginning, which was about I'm not sure why we are incentivizing turnover by allowing the rents to be set to market rate once they clear out. That's hugely problematic. I don't think it's reasonable to expect people who are living in places that have to leave to have to look at an inventory of units that have all been raised, because once they've been empty, they go to market rate. If they couldn't afford the place they were living in, they're certainly not going to be able to afford another one that's been taken up to market rate. So it's really incentivizing turnover.
Let me just respond to that question. You are prohibited from doing anything about that. As soon as a tenant leaves that unit, the landlord can increase the rent to market rate. That's what state law allows, and it restricts cities from doing anything different. And so that's why you see that happening.
Does that cost a hop?
Yes.
Well, November ballot, people.
So, market rents, who determines that? I mean, I'm hearing market rents, and I'm a real estate appraiser, so I know what market rents are. What I would suggest is, instead of charging landlords to be on the registry, the unit registry, let's make it free. And they tell what the rents they are that they're giving, and then you can extrapolate what market rents are. But every time we do something, we have to charge, and it doesn't help anything.
Who determines the voucher rates for the housing authority? Does anybody know that?
The housing is the federal government.
Because it seems
Housing and urban development.
I think that's one of the biggest drivers of the rental rates, because landlords can ask huge numbers and the housing authority writes blank checks for their tenants. So that is a huge issue for rental rates.
Yo tenía una pregunta para el abogado, si podía explicar un poquito más acerca de la fecha de diciembre 31, por lo que pudimos entender, sería retroactivo hasta esa fecha.
So I would like the lawyer to explain a little bit more about what you were talking about, the date, December 31st. You said it was going to be retroactive. Can you explain a little bit more?
Right, so what that means is if the city council adopts the rent stabilization ordinance, which limits the number of times or puts a lesser than 5% cap on the maximum rent each year, that cap and that limit gets rolled back to December 31st of 2023. So if there were any rent increases that occurred between December 31st of 2023 and the effective date of this ordinance, and they're inconsistent, that rent would have to be rolled back to December 31st of 2023 to be consistent with the ordinance that the council adopts.
Thank you everyone for joining us today and providing your questions and feedback. If you have any additional questions or concerns, please write them on the sideboard right here. You can also find the presentation, the draft ordinance online, and you can also pick it up in person at our Community Development Department at 65 West Alisal Street. Thank you.